So I'm excited.
Well, that sounds really cool. And yeah, tech glitches are always part of the process. So get used to that, the fun of technology. So I'm excited. Video podcasts, one of my favorite topics. Let's go.
Yes, and they have very little as usual. They have very little idea what we're talking about tonight. I have all of my notes set up, and yeah, we're going to get into it. So, specifically tonight, we are talking about launching your podcast and the process of launching your podcast, whether that is video or audio strictly. So, we kind of want to go through like the steps, the main steps that we think about when it comes to launching a podcast. So, the first thing we want to do is figure out what the show's about. I feel like that kind of has out like those are basically the basis of your show from which you will continue to build moving on.
No, I don't think yeah, that is definitely a very big thing that one thing that we see a lot of the time when it comes to podcasting, and it's actually so prevalent that there is a term for it, and that is called pod fading. And that is that there are so many podcasts that will get started, and within the first 15 episodes or so, they get started and they just quit because they have given up because they're not seeing the results that they want. And a big way to kind of avoid that is to make sure that you really know why you're doing this. What's the reason why you're creating this? And if your only reason is, oh, I just want to make money, I mean, that's a good reason to do it. But I challenge you to try and go a little deeper and think about what impact could I make from this? Well, what kind of makes me special with this, and how can I help people? Because that's the thing that's going to motivate you to keep going when things start to get hard.
Would you say that when thinking about what your podcast is going to be about and specifically what it's going to be called, that you need to kind of like think about the pain points, like what your audience is dealing with, searching for, or specifically where they're going to be looking for some information?
That's going to get into more so in the second point. But to round out this first point, I had something that I was going to say.
You do need to share a mic.
Oh, is mine being iffy again? Okay. Those technical difficulties we were talking about. So we're just going to set that one over there. Anyways, yes, so you definitely, in part of setting up your podcast, you need to figure out, that's what I was going to say. It's suggested that when setting up your podcast and figuring out your theme, your topic, you need to sit down and write out at least 20 episode titles. Because if you can't get 20 episode titles in, you need to rethink what your podcast is going to be about. Or at least not necessarily scrap the thing entirely, but you need to shift and maybe figure out something else that you can do along those lines that's maybe a little more broad, or just taking it from a different perspective so that you have more to talk about, so you avoid the pod fading, like Josh was talking about. But yeah, then the next thing you have to figure out is who's going to listen to your podcast, who's going to watch it, who are the people that you need to basically make your content for. So not only people that like the same topic that you're going into, but people that are going to mesh with your personality. And like there's so many different aspects to figuring out the audience, not only the audience that's going to be interested in your content, but the audience that you want to be watching your content.
Yeah, definitely. A big problem that, yeah, it goes along with the pod fading. Another big cause to that is that people start creating a podcast and they're not seeing the results that they want from it. And one reason why that happens a lot is because people create like they have this idea of like, oh, this would be really cool, I want to create a podcast on this, yeah, I can talk about this stuff. But they don't stop to think about, okay, is that actually going to attract the type of people that I want? I mean, if you're using your podcast as a marketing tool, you have to think about like who are the people that you want to attract for your business. And then when you're thinking about your podcast, you really need to think about not just, oh, what's something that I think would be fun to do, or what's something that I know a lot about, but what are they interested in? What things would they want to listen to? And then create a podcast about those things so that you always make sure you're attracting those types of people.
Yeah, and I think you have to really think about where your audience is in your journey. So when you're thinking about the people that you're targeting with your message, you really have to think, where are they in that decision making process? Where are they in their business journey? What are they dealing with now? Because it's really easy to maybe hit them at the wrong point where they're not going to be ready for your services yet, or to hit them to where they're actually already past the point of where they need you. So you got to make sure and find that sweet spot and speak to those pain points that are specifically right there where they are in their journey.
Yeah, and I feel like if you guys caught the episode, we were talking about podcasting trends. We talked a lot about a lot of podcasts niching down, and I feel like that kind of plays into this. It's people who are searching for their audience, that they not only that want to listen to them, but that they want to make content for. So they are niching down and making more precise content to specifically target those people where they are. So, next thing we're going to be talking about is the format of the show you want to make. Now, this is really it's a really important thing to think about because it's going to influence just about everything else from this point out. And what I mean by that is like, how many hosts do you want? Like for us, we've got our 3 hosts here. We did have a podcast at one point where we just had one host. It didn't work out very well. It didn't last very long because we definitely went into the pod fading thing because that wasn't a format that really suited us well. But the chemistry of having the 3 of us here talking back and forth is something we really enjoy, and I hope is entertaining for you guys. We find it entertaining. So how many hosts do you want? Do you want to do just a audio podcast, or do you want to do video as well? You want to do it live or recorded? What type of content? I tried to say type and style at the same time. What type of content do you want to make? Like educational, storytelling stuff? Do you just want to interview people? Um, all of this is really important to think about at this point because it's going to determine all of the next steps is going to determine the equipment you buy, what kind of setup you need, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's also really important to think about because you really want to find something that you're going to really enjoy doing. Like, kind of back to the example Jenny gave with the first podcast that we had started, it was very much just an informational podcast. It was just one person sitting there. It was mostly me doing it. Occasionally, we had some of the rest of us on, but it was mostly just me sitting there talking, talking, teaching, teaching, talking. And I like teaching, but when that's the only thing that's happening and it's just 30 minutes of me just sitting here talking, to me, that's a little bit boring. And so that's why when we were trying to do this, we were like, we have to switch it up. We have to do something different. And that's why we chose this type of style. So the thing I want to encourage you to do is like when you're trying to figure out what you want your podcast to be, you should just take some time and listen to a whole bunch of different podcasts and
Oh,
see
yes.
what other people are doing, because there are some things that you may not even know are out there, things that could be done that you'll really love to do and will work really well for you. So take some time to just do some research on what other people are doing and find what thing you feel like fits best for you.
Yeah, and you probably already have a style of content that suits you better, and you probably already know what that is. But if you need any help, maybe looking at some possibilities or figuring that out, reach out to us. But all of us usually have a style that we're more comfortable with, that we resonate more with ourselves, and that makes us more comfortable delivering that kind of content. So for us, it's very educational. We just love to give value, and we've been through a lot. We've kind of grown this business from the ground up, really knowing nothing and learning as we went. And it's been great because now we know exactly what business owners struggle with. We know from every level and every stage. what they've gone through, and then we love to share that back. Like even with the tech glitches or any issues that we had, you're going to find that we share about that because our whole journey is to be educational and to help our listeners. So
Yes, which is why we're not ashamed when we have when we have tech glitches or little things like that, and in fact, we'll share them quite openly because it's like, hey, we learned this thing today. Here you go, so you don't make this mistake that we made. So this next one, I literally just titled "Get Creative" because now is the time to get creative. So at this point, you know what your show is about, you know what the purpose of it is, you know who's going to listen to it, you know the format of it. So now it's time to get the name. It's time for your name and for your artwork for you to figure out the style of your podcast, how you want it to look, which is very important because again, it's going to be partly you and your own style and partly attracting the people that you want to attract. So that's very important. And then also the name is very important. There are some tips that I found for when you're naming a podcast. Things like avoiding the words the something something podcast because there are a million the something something podcasts out there in the world. So getting something super catchy, something easy to spell and pronounce, something that you can say and someone will immediately know how to spell it. A lot of people don't think about this, but when you're doing a YouTube channel, a social media, a podcast, whatever you're naming, you have to be able to say it and have someone know how to spell it because if not, you can say your name and no one's going to be able to find you.
Yeah, definitely your name is incredibly important because it's kind of like the first impression people get.
Mhm.
And when people are searching for a podcast, a lot of the times if they don't connect with the name of your podcast, they're not going to look any further into your podcast at all. And I've done this before a lot of the times where there's a specific kind of topic of podcast that I want to find. And so I go searching and I will just immediately looking at the title, I'll be able to cross off the first six of them because I'm like, yeah, that's not for me. That's not for me. That's not what I'm looking for. And then I'll find one that I'm like, oh, yeah, that says the things that I'm wanting specifically out of this podcast. So that's the one that I'm going to try first. So that and your show artwork, they both work together in that they're people's first reaction of your podcast. So you want it to be something that is eye-catching and draws them in. You also want to make sure that it is something that people will be able to immediately recognize what your podcast is about. And not just in general, but specifically, what is the exact thing you're going to help them with? What is the exact thing they can expect from this podcast? And then another big thing that I see a lot that really helps people stand out is just sharing their personality and kind of the feeling of the podcast in the show artwork. If you have a very relaxed, laid back podcast, you don't want to have a very polished, like corporate looking logo because then people are going to see that and be expecting it to be a lot more formal than it actually is. And the same thing is in reverse. If you have a very formal podcast, if you're very fast paced and informational, you don't want it to be a very relaxing looking logo. You want it to be to where when someone looks at your title and your show artwork, they immediately can tell, okay, this is on the topic that I want. I like this person has the personality that I want. It's the type of feeling that I want. It's the type of content delivery that I want. Because if you can't meet those expectations from that first impression, then people just aren't going to give you a try.
Which sounds like a lot of pressure, I know, but I do want to stress that in fact, I would say the majority of podcasts do not get all of the steps exactly where they want them until they're 30 plus episodes in. It is perfectly fine. We're about to go in and talking about equipment and stuff, but it is perfectly fine to start with what you have, make something that you think looks kind of cool, and then just go with it. And if you want to change it later, you can change it later. There are podcasts that have done whole rebrands where they change the name, the look, the style, the everything of their podcast once they get like 15, 20 episodes in, because they're like, oh, this isn't actually what I want. And that is perfectly fine to do. So, like, we're going through all of this stuff, but know that it's okay to start with start where you are, start with what you have, and then grow from there. So, as I said, now it is time to get your equipment, which is both an exciting and potentially terrifying stage, because then comes the, oh my God, what do I need? What is the best thing to get? How much money am I going to spend? All of this. Again, like I just got done saying, it's okay to start with where you are. Honestly, most smartphones nowadays are going to have a good enough mic and or camera to start a podcast right then and there. You will want to, especially as this year progresses, we're seeing people starting to spend more money earlier on in their podcasts. So equipment is something you're going to have to think about pretty soon into it. But again, you can just start with what you have. So going on equipment, you're going to need your mics, your recording software, if you're doing a video one, lights, cameras, all of this stuff is stuff to consider to figure out what it is exactly that you want before you actually start launching your podcast or even getting into writing episodes or any of that.
Yeah, and I will say that definitely the most important thing, like if you don't have a lot of money but you have some money to spend, the top priority thing to invest on first is going to be a microphone. Because having a really good quality microphone makes a huge difference on a podcast, which is mostly audio based. And even on video podcasts, a lot of people will be kind of listening to it more than they're watching it or watching it off and on. So, because of that, having really great audio quality is one of the most important things to consider when you're creating a podcast. So, if you have a little bit of money to spend on equipment, then, and it doesn't even have to be a super expensive thing. These microphones that we're using, they're just standard Blue Yeti microphones. I think they're like $100 a piece. So they're really not that expensive to get a decent quality microphone that you can start out with. And then, like we said, as you go on, you can start to invest more and more into it if you start feeling really comfortable with how your podcast is going.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about video podcasting, which we highly recommend, um, then you just need to think about where you're going to be. What's your background going to be like? What is your lighting going to look like? Do you want something like a table in front of you? Do you want to be standing up at a standing desk? We do that some. Do you want a cup of coffee sitting there? Do you want to have your microphone in view? Just things like that, depending on the style you're going for and the feeling you want to convey. So I've watched a lot of video podcasts that feel very welcoming from the first glimpse you get of their background and the room they're in. It just welcomes you right in. So, and then I've been with others and they're kind of blurry background and clutter, and it was just something that was not appealing at all. So just something to think about when you're going that route.
Which again kind of just leads into your style and the format of your podcast and all of that. As you see, we have just a very simple background for now. We're planning on doing big things with it, but it's also perfectly fine to just get in a room that has a nice looking wall and just sit there and be like, "Hey, this is our thing." So, all right, now we're moving on to the real exciting stuff. Getting ready to record your first episode. Now, specifically talking about outlining your first episode, because it is very important when you go into a podcast to have some sort of outline for what you're going to do. Because as you can see, I have my computer here with our outline. If not, we would be all over the place. I love us, but we are not good at staying on, especially this one, not good at staying on topic without some sort of
information.
but it might not all stay on the same topic. But yeah, so then comes the question: do you script out your podcast episodes or do you not script out your podcast episodes? And there's no necessarily like straight up yes or no to this. It really depends on your style, on what you're going for. If you're more into a storytelling format, you're probably going to want to script it. If it's more like educational, like what we're doing, you might not want to fully script it and just like get your points down and ramble on like we're doing right now. But it is something you want to consider going into it, is whether or not you're going to script your episode. And specifically looking at the first episode of your podcast, this one's really important because this is going to be kind of setting the theme for your podcast moving forward. So as you are outlining and or scripting your podcast, the first episode of your podcast, you really want to think, what is the one main takeaway we want people to get from this podcast? And that's what we're going to be talking about in the first episode.
Yeah, and you should also talk some about like kind of the format of the podcast. Really, the first episode is a really good place to let people know what this podcast is like, not just what are we talking about, but how are we talking about it? How long are the episodes going to be? How frequently are we going to create episodes? Like all of these types of things are really good to let people know. Because again, when people are looking for podcasts, they want to make sure that it's the right thing for them before they spend 45 minutes listening to an episode and then go away disappointed. So the more you can do on the front end to make sure people are aware of what to expect from your podcast, that helps people to be a lot more confident in giving time to you because they feel more confident that you're going to deliver to them the thing that you had actually promised to deliver to them. And another note when it comes to the scripting versus just outlining, we and the type of content we create, we do both of those. Like I said, for this podcast, where we mostly just do outline, we don't do scripting for this. But for our YouTube videos and stuff, we do video scripts instead of just talking normally because those are a lot more fast paced. But the one thing that I do want you to keep in mind, if you're thinking about scripting your podcast, that's fine. Just like I had mentioned earlier, the audio quality of the podcast is the most important thing. So if you are going to read a script, you just need to make sure that you don't sound like you're reading a script.
Maybe practice it a few times.
Yeah, because people can tell if you're reading a script unless you have done a lot of practice. And of course, we've been reading scripts and videos for over 2 years now, so we've gotten pretty good at it, and we can sound like we're not reading a script when we're doing our videos. And it's something that just comes with practice. But if people come on and it's very obvious that you're like, okay, so today we are going to be talking about this thing, and here's why. And you just sound, yeah, yeah. Also, if you're just like, like things like that pull people out of it because it's like it makes them realize, oh wait, this isn't them just talking. This is like a planned thing that they did ahead of time, and they have a whole script. It just makes people. It makes it harder for people to relate to what you're talking about. So it's fine to do scripting, and that can make creating a podcast a lot easier. You just have to make sure to do some practice so that when you read your script, you sound like you do when you're just talking normally, and that'll make people relate to you a lot more.
Yeah, exactly what you just said, because the whole purpose of long form content like a podcast is to make people relate to you. People get to know you, your mannerisms, your style, your voice, your smile. All of those things really either attract or distract people, repel them away. So you're looking to attract your people you're going to like to work with and who are going to want to work with you. So yeah, really letting that part of you and your personality shine through.
All right. So now at this point in the process, you have your first episode recorded. Cool, exciting stuff. So now you got to figure out, where are you putting it? Because there's a ton of platforms you can choose. And honestly, you can choose all of them. So like, again, if you're doing video podcasts, YouTube is way upping its game in the video podcast space. So if you're looking to do a video podcast, highly suggest YouTube is one of the places you put it. Also, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, there's a Google, is it just Google Podcasts? Is really popular. There's Pandora, I think, is also doing a lot of podcast
Mhm.
stuff and also getting really popular. There's tons of places that you can decide to put your podcast. And you literally, there is nothing wrong with putting it on all of them, but figuring out where you're putting it, how you're putting it, all of
How
that.
about your website?
Yes, your website is also a great place to put your podcast. Um, yeah, so just figuring out where all you're putting it. And then it's time to start getting ready for launch day. Now, launch day can be super exciting, but you gotta start getting people prepared for it ahead of time. Um, we used to do like when we launched our podcast originally, we had a like a podcast launch group that was literally just like a hype up party, get excited group for like 2 weeks ahead of time before the podcast launched, where we showed the artwork that when we just got like our artwork figured out, when we finally figured out the actual title of it, when we got the first episode recorded, we were like, yay, first episode's recorded, and like all of the stuff into this group of people that were just really excited for this. And so we began making it up into be this really big thing so that when the podcast comes out, everybody flocks over and they're like, yeah, podcast time. So something like that, but you don't have to like go that far into it, but putting stuff out on your social media, on your website, on your wherever you have, um, getting your power partners to start talking about it to their groups, getting your like friends and family to share about it all over the place. Anywhere you can get stuff out about your podcast that you're about to launch, do it. Just start getting the word out absolutely everywhere so that on launch day, you can put it out there and you're going to get a rush of traffic to it that very first day, which is really important for the algorithms to see that rush of traffic.
Yeah, and it's also really important because just in general, with basically any sort of social media marketing or podcast or video, whatever type of marketing you do, where you have people who are following you and listening to your content, the more people you have, the more people you're going to get, generally speaking. The more subscribers you have on YouTube, the more YouTube will recommend your podcast. The more listeners you have on podcasting platforms, the more the podcasting platforms are going to recommend your content. So it is completely possible to not advertise it at all, start it out with 0 listeners and grow a podcast, but it's just going to be very slow as you slowly gain one more listener. A week later, one more listener. A week later, 1.5 more. I don't even know how that works, but you get the point. It's like very slow. But if you could start out with 500 listeners, and then those start to grow, because first off, that's going to make the algorithms go better, because the algorithm says, oh, well, they have a lot of people following. Obviously, people are interested, so let's show it to some more people. But also, one of the most, in my opinion, one of the like best ways that podcasts get advertised is by word of mouth, is by someone listening to it, either really enjoying it or it was really helpful, and then they're like, hey, I have to tell someone about this, or hey, this person would benefit from this podcast, and they go and share that with someone else. So if you start out with 500 people that all listen to your podcast, and even a tenth of them are like, oh, this is really cool, let me keep listening, they're going to become really great fans of the podcast, and they will eventually keep sharing it to more and more people. So basically, the more work you can do ahead of time to make your launch day really powerful, the faster you're going to get that ball rolling and start getting real traction on your podcast.
And then after launch day, because you're not done after launch day, but after launch day, we got to talk about how you're going to make some money. So there's a bunch of different ways you can actually make money from your podcast now that it is launched. You got sponsor deals you can get, which there is a ton more sponsor money coming into podcasts in the upcoming year. It's another one of the trends we talked about, which is super exciting. So brands sponsoring podcasts to do a short, typically like 20-second little blurb about their product. Those are super common, super easy, as long as it's something that your audience would actually be interested in. Those are real easy ways to make money. Affiliate marketing, selling somebody else's products for them so that you get a cut of the profit. That's also like once you have like an engaged audience, that's also a really great way to make money. Selling your own products, your own products or services on your podcast obviously has to be a must if you're any sort of business doing podcasting. That's probably one of your big goals, is to get your products being sold off of that. Um, that's a great way to make money. And then there's things like membership sites. You can do, I know one of the big sites is like Patreon, but you can have memberships where your audience pays like 10, 15, $20 a month, and they get special rewards for doing so, like extra episodes or behind the scenes clips or like any little things like that.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can monetize your podcast.
Yeah,
and-
those were only a couple examples. There's a whole bunch more.
Yeah, and something that this is something that you really should be thinking about heavily when you're thinking about starting a podcast, because a lot of people make the mistake of starting the podcast, growing a following, and then being like, okay, I have enough following, how can I make money from this? And the problem is, if you do that, the amount of ways you can make money is going to be limited by the choices you made in setting up your podcast. But if you start at the beginning by saying you already know at this point the type of people that you want to be listening to your podcast, you already know what they're interested in. And so you can, based off of that, kind of decide, okay, what do I want to do on this podcast to make money? Do I want to do affiliate marketing for these people? Do I want to be selling my own stuff for these people? Do I want this to just be a sponsorship podcast? Like, there's all of these different things you can do, but think about it ahead of time, because then you can actually design your podcast around that. If you want to do a whole bunch of affiliate marketing, then you need to make sure that your podcast covers a lot of things that you can review, whether that, like, whether you are actually a review podcast, or if you're just teaching, but during your teaching you can give advice about certain pieces of equipment and things like that, or certain programs that you can then do affiliates for, things like that. Or if you're trying to sell your products, you have to make sure that the audience that you're attracting to your podcast is actually interested in the products that you want to sell, because a lot of business owners will create podcasts on what they are really good at, and then they'll attract an audience that doesn't need to buy what they're trying to sell. An example that I always used to give is, when I started in this business, the main thing that I did was video editing. I've moved more to the YouTube marketing side now, but I know a lot about video editing, and I can create a video editing podcast with no problem. I can talk all day long about different tips and techniques, how to make sure the video flows really well, all of that kind of stuff. But the problem is, who's that going to attract? It's going to attract a whole bunch of video editors who are trying to learn more about video editing. Video editors are not our ideal clients. So it does us no good if we have a podcast full of video editors, because we can't sell to them.
If someone was selling a course on video editing, that would be perfect, but that's not what we're selling.
Yeah, so just think about this ahead of time, and once you've decided on some ways that you think are really good and are going to fit for you, think about, how could I design this podcast to make this the most effective that it can possibly be? Don't go down the line and be like, okay, how can I fit in money making into this now? Go from the start saying, how can I design my podcast so that when we do have a following, we can make as much money as possible through these different avenues?
Yeah, so that is step by step the things you need to think about and what you need to do in order to launch not just a podcast, but a successful and money making podcast.
So what are some other ways we can help them if they're really looking to get started in the world of podcasting?
Well, if you guys are interested in getting started in the world of podcasting, I would highly suggest reaching out to us, because we have a lot of tools and things that can help. In fact, we have a whole kit that we call our podcast launch in a box,
Or Pleiad.
or Pleiab for short, because it's podcast launch in a box is a really long thing to say. But so we have our Pleiab that, if you'd like any more information on, reach out to all of us. It literally it's so much this is like months worth of information gathering that we just shoved into one little box and we hand to you on a silver platter, and it's like, here, this is
Everything.
everything you need to know about every aspect of starting a podcast. It goes into depth on like different types of equipment and the different like platforms you can use to get your podcast out there, and even the tips for like the names
Knowing your
and
audience,
knowing your audience, and it goes into everything. So
designing your show artwork, all of it.
all of it. So if you want more information about that, reach out to
We'll put
any one of us. We can
link
put
in the
yes, we will put
comments.
the link in the comments. So whether you're watching us on LinkedIn or on YouTube, either one, check the comments because there will be a link there where you can go and learn more about our podcast Launch in a Box. And if you have any other questions related to podcasting or YouTube marketing, you can reach out to any one of us through YouTube or LinkedIn, either one.
Yep. Sounds
All
good.
right. So thank you guys for coming and watching. I had fun. I always have fun when I get to lead these things. So yeah, I hope you got a lot out of it, and we will see you next week, same time, same place.
Bye.
Bye.